So this will just be part two here. As provided earlier, he gave his confession when he believed that his lover at the time had told the detective about a confession of the murder that Romero had given him. That Romero had given him. His lover Neil told the police that he had given him a complex confession only days before Romero ended up confessing to the police. Experts provided their expertise that he was suffering from mental disorders that caused him to fabricate stories and lie. Finally, the eyewitness testimony was used heavily by the jury. However, eyewitness testimony is not as solid as we think it is. Also, while the husband's case remained cold for 4 years, 4.5 years, that was the murder victim's wife had identified three other men who she believed was the husband's killer, all which ended up being released with no charges. Research into these different areas and topics have proven that eyewitness testimony is actually quite weak, when the majority of the population actually believes that our memory is quite strong. We also now know that false confessions can be common under different circumstances, especially when a person is pressured to give one using different unethical interrogation techniques. However, in this case, mental disorders was the driving force behind the false confession. That's kind of just a general overview of the different factors as well as a summary of the case. So now I'll go into the empirical articles. The first one, eyewitness accounts, false facts, false memories, and false identification. This article will provide critical information about what was one of the driving factors behind Romero's conviction. This is the only topic that I will touch upon that does not directly refer to something that Romero did, but a factor that the jury had which ultimately would cause his conviction. This article will help explain how the wife may have misidentified the people multiple times. I believe that this article will be able to provide solid information about people's opinion about eyewitness identification, about how it's supposed to be very good, how our memory is supposed to be very good, as well as it'll help explain why the wife may have misidentified the killers multiple times over, and why the jury used this as a driving force for the conviction, despite the wife before getting it wrong. False confessions. How can psychology so basic be so counterintuitive? Arguably, Romero's false confession was the driving factor in his false conviction. This article provides the psychology behind such confessions and why they can happen. When we look at the idea of a false confession, most people think that it would be impossible for someone to confess to something that they didn't do. This article provides insight into what would cause someone to make a false confession. So, arguably, this is probably what actually got Romero convicted. So, I believe that it will provide a good idea at how how confessions can be so powerful, and it can also help us explain why Romero made a false confession, why it happened, as well as other different examples of false confessions that have been made. I think this will probably be the strongest point in my paper because the false confession was ultimately the driving factor which got Romero convicted. Finally, inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity, and antisocial personality disorder, which is the best predictor of false confessions. Finally, Romero suffered from a condition that caused him to create a false confession. This article aims to explain why these certain conditions could lead someone to create a false confession. Experts on Romero's appeal case determined that he did suffer from antisocial personality disorder, as well as borderline personality disorder. This article examines what Romero suffered from, as well as different conditions that can lead to false confessions. So I think this will actually be a really good understanding. It'll give us, throughout my paper, it'll give a good understanding at why Romero made the false confession, what he was suffering from, as well as other different mental disorders that other people may be suffering from that may cause them to create false confessions. It'll be a nice kind of broad arch that brings everything together to help understand why this mental disorder played such a big factor within his conviction and why he made a false confession. Finally, topics applied to the real world. False confessions have been plagued on the criminal justice system for years. Recent research, however, sheds light on why they happen. Because of this, interrogation techniques have been changed to be more ethical in order to limit false confessions, however they still may occur. So, throughout, especially in recent history, we've seen these false convictions and people giving confessions just to be done with it, just to get out of it, just to be done with everything. So that's one thing in the real world. Building off of the previous point, mental disorders can also play a role in false confessions. I believe that more research into this will help police officers and detectives understand why someone may make a false confession. Finally, eyewitness testimony has been at the center of research for some time. Human memory has been a subject of scrutiny. So we've seen many times where people misidentify people, and it has caused false convictions. Thank you.